Hello again, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of our Armoured Actions shows this week. And as you've noticed, the theme is going to be tanks and tank battles, tank engagements. But the point is we're trying to sort of draw some conclusions. We're not just going to say who won this one, who lost this one. We're going to try and determine what decisions were made that improved things. How did the doctrine improve? How did tactics improve? What did they learn in combat? How did it benefit either side? Who were some of the pivotal figures involved in these developments? So we're going to try and draw some conclusions. So if you are new to the channel, had lots of new people joining up over the last few weeks, thank you, welcome along. If you haven't clicked subscribe yet, please click the button to subscribe. Please consider becoming a patron, becoming a YouTube member so we can bring you more of these shows. But without further ado, I'll introduce today's guest. So I've brought in lots of experts from lots of different backgrounds, but today's guest has done it, been there. He's been in command of men in combat himself, has written about Iraq, Afghanistan, the modern army. But when he retired from the US Army as a general, his first World War II book was this one, which I'm holding up. And as usual, folks, the link to purchase it is in the description below. Panzer Killers, Daniel P. Bulger, about 3rd Armored Division. And so without further ado, I shall bring Dan into the show. So good afternoon where you are, Dan. How are you doing today?
Doing well, Paul. Thank you.
So, simple question. In the introduction, now you've pretty long, distinguished career, served your country, and then when you looked back to World War II, you could have chosen whatever unit you want to do because your career took you to kind of air mobile, to cavalry, to infantry. You did a bit of everything. Why 3rd Armored Division? Simple question.
It actually went back to when I met one of the most well-known American World War II commanders, and that was General Mark Clark. It was back in my college days. Mark Clark, when he retired from the U.S. Army, lived in Charleston, South Carolina, and that's where my college was located. It's a military college, the Citadel, affiliated with the state of South Carolina. And General Clark, one afternoon at his quarters, entertained myself and a couple other cadets. And General Clark, as you would expect from a very senior commander and a very forceful personality, even in his older days, you didn't really have a discussion with General Clark. He orated and you listened. And me as just a little cadet at the time, I was happy to do that. But one of my colleagues was a little bolder. And when General Clark had finished a dissertation on the importance of picking the right commanders and how he had helped choose all the key American Division Corps commanders who fought under his command in Italy, and even had input to his colleague Dwight Eisenhower on those who fought in France and Germany and Belgium and Luxembourg and all that during the Northwest Europe campaign of 1944-45. One of my colleagues says, well, General Clark, was there anybody that did well in the war that wasn't on your list? General Clark, sits back and he goes, Rose. And I'm thinking, is that a guy's name? Yes, it was a name. Maurice Rose. He was a superb division commander. And the Germans killed him right near the end of the war. Got filed away for years while I went and did all the Army stuff that Paul talked about. And when I got out of the Army and I was interested in learning about my predecessors from the World War II generation, sadly, very few people who lived or even remember World War II are with us anymore.
Yeah,
I remembered that comment from General Clark, and that's what got me interested in this subject and the genesis of Panzer Killers.
Well, that is a pretty cool story as to how you got interested in the unit. It's, we've had people whose relatives served or they visited the battlefield when they were young, but Mark Clark, love him or loathe him, and there's going to be people watching this who are in both of those camps. You cannot fail to notice someone like Mark Clark, and if he says this guy is good, it's an opinion and it's a good starting point. So, as I said there in the top of the show, there, Dan, it's the idea this week is to take some lessons, learn some things, and you've written about modern wars. You've written about not just where things go well, but where things go badly. And as someone who's been there and done it, is it fair to say in a way that we learn more from our mistakes than we do our successes generally in warfare?
Well, I would say that we have the opportunity to learn from our mistakes, and that good militaries, good armies, good regiments, good divisions, good corps, good armies learn from those mistakes. The ones that are poor, ill-led, or mixed up, they miss the opportunity. In fact, They continue to do the same failed things again and again, even though they're not working.
That's a great answer, and that is when it comes to armored warfare in World War II, you do see the same errors being repeated, and not just within one nation copying another nation's errors, and then yet by the end of the war, as we talked about yesterday with Pete about the Spanish Civil War, the learning curve that everybody went through from 1939 to 45 was incredible. I know we're going to talk later on about some improvements in guns and suspension and engines and shell size and range and maintenance. People, if you were an armored officer in one of the Allied armies in 1935 or something, you were a junior officer, you wouldn't have been able to imagine the developments that would have been in your command 10 years later. I mean, just incredible. And so, even when your service, Iraq to Afghanistan, the technology increase, I'm guessing was a more gentle curve than what happened in 39, 45.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the difference was the scale of combat in World War II was so dramatically larger than anything any of us have had in our current experience. And the other is the stakes. I mean, You fail in World War II, your country is going to be destroyed. Maybe everybody is going to be killed. And that happened in way too many places. So on a place like fighting in Soviet Russia, fighting in Western Europe, I mean, it was kill or be killed, with tens of thousands of people involved in that, to include the local civilians, their lives, their fates resting on these clash of tanks and desperate soldiers.
Yeah, absolutely. The stakes couldn't have been higher. So you've come with a PowerPoint that you're going to be in control of tonight. So we're talking about the Ardennes. I mean, so folks, if you're watching this is almost like an extra show, a bonus DVD extra from the Ardennes fortnight we did a few weeks ago, although it fits in just as well to Armored Actions Week. But I'll hand over to you to do the presentation, and then, folks, we're going to mostly leave questions to the end of the show today, just because that's how we're going to do it. But please feel to share comments as we go along. But we're going to hand over to Dan to kind of give us his expert view on 3rd Armored Division and General Rose, and then we'll do questions at the end. So over to you, Dan.
Well, thanks, Paul. What I wanted to talk about today, and what I want to get everybody thinking about, is what it must have been like for the soldiers of the 3rd Armored Division, United States Army, facing the German counterattack in the Bulge, a counterattack led by the German panzers, the German armor, the force that had paced the Blitzkrieg going all the way back to the invasion of Poland in 1939. This black and white picture here from after the Battle of Bulge, I believe, from what I could tell from the caption on the original Signal Corps photo, it appears to have been taken in January after the snow melted from that particular snowfall. And you can see here the road sign indicating the way to Manhay. Manhay was one of the key clashes between armored forces. 3rd Armored Division was involved. U.S. 7th Armored Division was involved. 75th Infantry Division involved. And on the German side, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, one of their more dangerous units. And if you look closely on the right side of this, you can see a knocked out Panther tank. If you would have asked a person from the 3rd Armored Division, a soldier serving in the Bulge, what worried him the most, it was an encounter with the German Panther. Not that they didn't know how to handle it, but they knew that if that happened, they were going to have to do everything in their power to defeat that German armored force. And the Panthers in particular were very good tanks, well-manned, and dangerous to the Allies. And the 3rd Armored Division encountered more than their share in the Bulge. And Manhay was one of those fights.
Yep.
So let's see if I can get this thing to move along. There we go. So the Germans, just to remind everybody, they launched a major counteroffensive in December, the so-called Hitler counteroffensive. The Fuhrer forced it down the throat of his general staff. They really would have preferred to save their forces to fight on the German border. But Hitler insisted they were going to take a gamble, and he in typical Hitler fashion, He was always right. Just ask him. He was going to punch through the weak American forces in the Ardennes Forest. And remember, the Germans had crossed through the Ardennes Forest when they invaded France in 1870. They'd come through the Ardennes in 1940. They had smashed through there in 1914 as well. So this was a route they used. Amazingly, the Americans, our senior commanders, up to and include Dwight D. Eisenhower, discounted the Ardennes. They were using it as a rest area, the ghost front, the American troops called it. Nothing seemed to happen there. Units that have been badly beaten up in other fights up around Aachen or the Hürtgen Forest were sent down there to recover. and then new units were put in the line to train up and get prepared to fight. So the Germans came in hard, 2 Panzer armies, 6th Panzer Army, largely SS Panzer units, 5th Panzer Army, regular German army troops. As we'll see, 3rd Armored Division had to deal with parts of both of those Panzer armies. And I put up the numbers here, but the only thing I would mention, 1st U.S. Army, although they had 150,000 soldiers spread along the front, most of them were grouped up around the Aachen area and right about where you see that other flag for 9th U.S. Army. That was the weight of the 1st Army. There were very few. There were only a few divisions, 4 divisions in the front line and an armored division behind them down there through the Ardennes. And then you'd pick up with Patton's 3rd Army and such to the south. So this offensive caught the Americans by surprise. There's a whole other section to do on Allied intelligence and what was known and wasn't known. The bottom line is miscalculation by the Allies and a bold, risky gamble by Hitler and the Germans. The thought to push all the way up to Antwerp, split away the Canadians, the British, 21 Army Group, split them away from most of the Americans, cause enough of a crisis in the command that somehow this would result in a German success on the Western Front. Didn't turn out that way, but it was a hell of a big counterattack. And the Americans had to deal with that. Yep. So let's look a little closer here. The 3rd Armored Division was one of 12 American armored divisions in Europe at that time. There would eventually be 16. One was down in Italy, the 1st Armored Division, but the other 11 were up in Europe. 3rd Armored Division was an unusual armored division. There you see in the picture there's Maurice Rose, who's the division commander. More on him as we talk. That's the Rose that General Clark referred to. Yep. His deputy there, Brigadier General Doyle Hickey, commanded Combat Command A. And another Brigadier General named Truman Boudinot commanded Combat Command B. Combat Command R was under Colonel Bobby Howes. But I mentioned the 3rd Armored Division. The 3rd Armored Division and the 2nd Armored Division were different than the others in Europe. They had 6 tank battalions. By this time of the war, all the other American armored battalions had 3 tank battalions, 3 infantry battalions mounted in half-tracks, 3 self-propelled artillery battalions. So 2nd and 3rd were considered heavy divisions because they had those extra tanks. One of the things that I'm sure is coming out already, goes all the way back to lessons learned in the Spanish Civil War and some of the other discussion we're going to have this week about armored actions. The Germans early on figured that a proper armored formation needed combined arms, about equal amounts of infantry, tanks, and self-propelled artillery that could keep up with the tanks. And the infantry had to be mounted in trucks or preferably half-tracks, so it could also move out under fire with the tanks. That's contrary to what most people would think, especially if you like to play games like Call of Duty or you watch movies like Fury and things like that, where it seems like the tanks are out on their own doing tank things. In reality, that was not the way any of the major countries learned to fight. Some of them started out that way. We think particularly some of the early British operations in North Africa. But it was learned the hard way that you had to have this mix of combined arms. And so the 3rd Armored Division reflects that, although it's a little heavier on the tanks than the other unit. Now, why is that important? You see that the Combat Command A and Combat Command B in this little slide are encased in green boxes. They were actually detached from 3rd Armored Division when the Germans counterattacked. In the scrambling to get something to contain the front, General Rose lost his Combat Command A, which was put directly under 1st Army to hunt for German paratroopers that had dropped behind the Allied lines. And the fear was that those German paratroopers were going to get a hold of American and British supplies of gas and ammunition, things that the Germans would use, particularly the fuel, which would help power them to go all the way to Antwerp. So Combat Command A was gone for the first part of the Battle of Bulge for 3rd Armored Division. Combat Command B was detached to reinforce the American 82nd Airborne Division, which was a paratrooper unit. So as a result, they pretty much had hand weapons and very small pack artillery and things like that. They had no tanks or anything, and they were going to be up against part of these German panzer formations. So Combat Command B went to reinforce the American Airborne. And so that left General Rose with only part of his division. Combat Command R, which 2 tank battalions and an armored infantry battalion and self-propelled artillery, and his armored reconnaissance battalion. This was a formation that's a recon or cavalry type unit. But the way they designated it back then in the U.S. Army was as an armor reconnaissance battalion. But as you can see, it's got some fighting capability, although I should mention a Stuart-like tank and the M8 Greyhound both had very thin armor and were equipped only with a 37 millimeter gun. So useful against German infantry, useful against German half-tracks, an easy prey to any kind of German panzer. So that was the 3rd Armored Division. When Rose was sent to deal, and he was sent to the north side of the Bulge, we'll look at where they fought this battle, he switched his chain of command. You know, one of the unusual things, if you're not familiar with this, in Allied order battle in particular, divisions would move between corps and army based on their task, particularly armored divisions. I mentioned the Americans only had 12 in Europe at this time. So they would move them around to wait the attack. But Rose's unit was unusual. The 3rd Armored Division stayed with 1st Army and 7th Corps almost the entire war. This is the only time they were actually moved to a different unit. It was for this first week in the Bulge. So Rose's usual superiors, he worked for 12th Army Group. Omar Bradley was the commander there. If you remember the old movie Patton, this is the guy that Carl Malden plays. Omar Bradley, everybody who met him said, gee, he looks like a Missouri school teacher. He was from the state of Missouri, and he had taught a lot in Army schools. The one thing that the Patton movie absolutely got right about Bradley is he was a team player. He was low key. He was pretty much a general that everybody liked working for because he was a good listener. Sadly, I don't think he was that tactically adept, but because he was a good team player, some of the tactically adept people under him did the job. Courtney Hodges, the 1st Army commander, although Rose knew him well, he was a headquarters general, distinguished record in the First World War, distinguished service cross fighting in the Meuse-Argonne Force, but he was well past his prime by World War II and frankly, out of his depth as an Army commander. But he was close friends to the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, and Eisenhower and Bradley liked him. So they looked after him. Lawton Collins, J. Lawton Collins, Lightning Joe Collins, his first name was Joseph. He had actually earned his reputation in the Pacific War with the Tropic Lightning Division. That's where he got the call sign Lightning 6 as the division commander there. He liked that call sign. He was a very much CNBC hands-on guy. When you think of Rommel with the 7th Panzer Division in 1940, or George Patton with 2nd Corps in North Africa, Collins was like that, but he lacked the abrasiveness that those guys had. He was a demanding commander, but he was also a good listener, and he was tactically adept. And he wasn't so much a bull in the china shop that you think of with Rommel or Patton. He could get along with other people. And this was Rose's usual command. And so basically, he worked for Collins. And Collins made sure that Hodges got jobs done. And Bradley trusted Hodges because Collins was in Hodges' army. All that goes away on the 19th of December when Rose and 3rd Armored Division minus are sent south to fight in the Bulge to fight this German panzer attack.
Sorry to just interrupt you for a second,
Dan,
just because I think it's worth mentioning is that we talked about in our other Ardennes shows is that since Normandy, the Allies have become quite used to dictating the battles on their terms. I mean, yes, the Germans counterattack, yes, the Germans do things there, but the Bradleys and Hodges and Collins have had the practice at getting their operations ready and mounting them sort of on their terms, on their calendar, at their diary, at their pace. And the thing that makes the Ardennes so unique is it was the last time where the Allies are reacting to the Germans, and it takes everybody from all the people on that slide there a little bit of time to adjust to the fact that, hang on, they've done it, we have to react to them, because they've kind of been out of practice at that.
Paul, really well said. In fact, Rose and his 3rd Armored Division team mentioned later, they said, we had never seen a mass panzer attack like this.
Yeah.
Even the fighting in the Ardennes was broken up by the hedgerow terrain and all that. This would be the first time that they would actually confront frontline German panzer divisions in force. And really, of the pictures of the men on this slide, the only one who had ever dealt with anything like that had been Montgomery, who'd been involved in the 1940 campaign in France, of course, fought in North Africa, fought in Sicily and Italy. He's the only one on this picture who has that. By the way, that's why Eisenhower sometimes gets a bad rap as a person with no real battlefield experience. He'd be the first to admit that. That wasn't his fault. He missed World War I. He certainly wanted to go there and do his job. And by World War II, he was already at a too high of a rank. And so he is the chairman of the board, if you will, for this effort in Europe. But one thing that Eisenhower did, a hugely important direction, that is why this slide looks like it does, he realized that the Bulge was something that had knocked the Allies off balance. And much to the frustration of his West Point classmate, Omar Bradley, he gave the northern half of the Bulge to Montgomery. He said, look, we got to have somebody up here who's got enough forces and can focus on this northern half. Bradley, you handle the southern half and you handle the counterattack that will eventually come up from the south. I'm going to let Montgomery handle the counterattack from the north that will pinch off this Bulge eventually. That was a very controversial decision. Bradley and his commanders like George Patton thought it was political and all that, but it was really practical. And it gets to what Paul said. In this battle, you've got to get people involved who are used to this type of a fight. And none of the Americans, to include Morris Rose, had ever seen this type of fight. But Montgomery had. Now, one challenge Montgomery had right away is Courtney Hodges was left in command of First Army. And when I say left in command, he was in command in name only. The poor guy, he was sick with what I believe was walking pneumonia. I've never seen a medical diagnosis. They kept saying a bad cold. Unlike some commanders in the war, Hodges was not a heavy drinker or anything like that. He was just, one interesting comment is somebody said in Montgomery's headquarters, well, the problem with Hodges is he's just too old and fragile. The interesting thing, he was the same age as Montgomery. He was actually 2 years younger than George Patton, who will lead the Allied counterattack from the south. It wasn't an age thing with Hodges. I think he was just a reticent person. And sadly, he spent most of the Battle of the Bulge in his headquarters. When Montgomery went down there, which was his way, Montgomery said, there's no grip in the American sector. I'm going to go down and sort that out. And he was a great sorter-outer. When he got to the Hodges First Army headquarters, Montgomery went back to his command post and immediately got on the phone with Eisenhower and said, this guy needs to go. He's lost it. He's not doing anything. And Eisenhower said, you're going to have to work with him. I can't remove him. He's doing what he can. Buck him up. And Montgomery realized he couldn't get rid of this American commander. Now, the Corps commander under Hodges, a new Corps commander, a guy who commanded the 82nd Airborne Division in the Normandy operation, a guy who had been frozen out of the Market Garden drop and ground attack in Holland, because as we know, the British 1st Airborne Corps took that mission. The new 18th Airborne Corps had never had a mission, but Matthew Ridgway was well experienced. He'd been involved in Sicily. He'd been involved in Italy. He'd fought in Normandy. He was an airborne commander, so he doesn't know a lot about tanks. So the one thing he told Montgomery, he also told Hodges, but it sort of went in one ear of Hodges and out the other, given Hodges' state at this point, sort of just shocked by what had occurred. Montgomery listened, though. And Ridgway said, I've got to have armor. You've got to give me some forces. All my paratroopers are equipped with hand weapons and very small artillery. I've got to have tanks. I'm fighting German armored formations. So Montgomery not only was heavily involved in moving 3rd Armored Division down there, he also detached 2nd Armored Division, the other heavy armored division from the American side, from 9th Army and sent them south as well as 7th Armored Division. And all of them would fight on the north face of the Bulge and be involved in Montgomery's counterattack. He did one other thing that a lot of Americans miss in this battle, and that is Montgomery also got British armor formations ready along the Meuse River's crossing. If there would have been a breakthrough, if guys like Rose and his 3rd Armored Division had not done the job, Montgomery already had a backstop to prevent the Germans from breaking across the Meuse River, which, by the way, they had done quite effectively in 1940. So that's the big picture situation. Here's the north side of the Bulge. 3rd Armored Division went in near a small town named Houghton. Just to remind ourselves, the Meuse River actually makes a 90-degree turn, so right there at Namur. So it runs east-west from Namur almost to the German border, and then it runs north-south from Namur through Dinant and there into France. The German preference, of course, is to cross this near Liège or Namur, basically cross that going to the north and head up toward Antwerp. But what the Americans or British were trying to do was squeeze them like toothpaste in a tube and force them further and further to the west. One of those forcing elements is 3rd Armored Division. Now, this map is very pleasant, and it's got nice little arrows and lines. The real battle was nothing like that. When 3rd Armored Division reached Houghton on the night of 1920 December, there were no Allied formations west of Houghton other than some service support units, a few road construction engineers. And the Germans had not yet reached that far into the Bulge. You see here these arrows. They weren't that far yet. But immediately, 3rd Armored Division began to take pressure from the two German Panzer Corps. The 58th, of course, coming from 5th Panzer Army, and then the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. The 58th came in first, led by the 116th Panzer Division, the Windhund, division, the Greyhound Division, a unit that had fought well in Normandy and was part of the German regular army. The SS guys won't come in for a few days. The other one I should mention is 560th Volksgrenadiers. I know in this forum, for those regular watchers, Volksgrenadiers have been discussed before. These were rebuilt formations. They took the cadre left over, usually from units that have been destroyed on the Eastern Front. And with that core of NCOs and officers, they built new units around them, sometimes elderly guys, a lot of times young people from the Hitler Youth or whatever. No lack of energy, but not a lot of battle experience. So in that regard, the veteran 3rd Armored Division has an advantage over the 560th, although not over these panzer formations. So one of the things when we talk about armored warfare is we understand, I mean, the listeners and watchers here certainly understand this. There was a qualitative difference between the Sherman and the Panther. The general line you always hear was, well, the Panther was much better than the Sherman. Took 5 Shermans to knock out a Panther. The best comment I ever heard about this was a German interviewed after the war. He says, yes, our Panthers, we took one of our Panthers. It took 10 of your vehicles to knock us out. The problem was you always had 11. And, it seemed like the Americans always had more. The Sherman and Panther, although the Panther had advantages in gunpowder, in armor, in ability to operate on rough and snowy terrain, there were some challenges. The Panther crews, in particular, dealt with a vehicle that was difficult to maintain, and that's not a small thing. Those Shermans also matched the American self-propelled artillery, some of the British self-propelled artillery. They matched the tank destroyers. You could trade parts. You could swap tools. In some cases, you could swap ammunition, fuel, all that engine parts. The Panther was a unique critter, and other than a few assault gun versions of it, hunting Panthers, Jagd Panthers and stuff, they couldn't really match with anything else. You couldn't swap pieces with a Tiger or with a Mark IV or anything like that. So an effective vehicle, but two different kinds of vehicles, two different approaches. The Americans, though, know they're outgunned. They cannot deal with a Panther. For a Sherman to fight a Panther head on head, the Panther would win. So the Americans had to come up with solutions to this particular challenge. It was not going to work to just try and outnumber them. So what did the Americans do? Well, this, I think Maurice Rose is a great thing, a person for us to look at, because he and his division came up with some interesting solutions. They weren't the only unit who did. The British units did as well, other American units. But the good thing for us as people interested in history, Rose codified it. He was able to write it down, and his training plan and what he did is still known to us today. And then when we interviewed members of the division over the years since World War II, they said, oh, yes, we were taught these methods to deal with the Panther, because they sure couldn't deal with it head to head. So if you ask Maurice Rose, and by the way, Dwight Eisenhower did, he said, how do you kill panzers? Rose's answer was combined arms. The American system in general in World War II was to send a bullet, not a man, which is another way of saying use firepower. Americans did not want to use human beings or even tanks and things like that if they could send firepower of various types. And we're going to look at all those types. So look what Rose wrote. This was his direct comment back to Eisenhower after the Battle of Bulge. He says, we compensate for our inferior equipment by efficient use of air, artillery, and maneuver. There's a lot in that little sentence there. There's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what I think, what really impressed me, Paul, you would say, well, he's a general. He didn't shy away from the fact that he knew the Shermans weren't as good as the Panthers when it came to a head-to-head fight. But he believed in them because he said, we know our equipment. And there, by the way, Hot in Belgium, I mentioned that was where the center of the 3rd Armored Division line. If you look at that picture right outside that one building, and this was taken when the snow was still on the ground in early January of 1945. That is a knocked out Panther near that 2-story building there. And they were able to knock out Panthers and do so effectively using these tactics. So combined arms. What was Rose talking about here? The first one was use of the air. Now, this is something, again, in movies and video games, integrating Allied air just seems like, well, of course I'm going to do that. It's heavily, capable. The Americans in particular and the British had some aircraft that were specifically tailored for ground attack. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the British Royal Air Force Typhoon were really good at that. The Thunderbolt, by the way, one of the things, it was very good. It was a very heavily built aircraft. It could dive effectively. The crews knew a lot about air support by the time of the Battle of Bulge, going all the way back to the Normandy campaign in Europe. The challenge the Thunderbolt had, a Typhoon from the Royal Air Force had 20 millimeter automatic cannon in the wings. The Thunderbolt carried 8 50 caliber machine guns. Now, 50 caliber machine guns are nothing to be sloughed off. They fire an 1.5 inch slug and all that, but they don't explode. They're round. They're solid metal. Punching through the top of a tank's armored deck, they could certainly chew up a German self-propelled gun or a half track. But the machine guns are nowhere near the equivalent of those cannon aboard the Typhoon. So what the Thunderbolts prefer to use, even more than gravity bombs, a 500-pound bomb dropping off the wings, were rockets, because you could align the rocket and the rocket would generally fly true. And so the rockets the Americans liked to use, the British had the RGP-3, which is about a 3-inch rocket. Typhoons were very good at shooting them, and it done tremendous damage in the Fillet Gap in Normandy in 1944. The Americans, because the Typhoon was an even slightly heavier built aircraft with a little more engine power than even the Typhoon, the Thunderbolt was, the Americans liked the high velocity aerial rocket, which the warhead of it was a 5-inch destroyer shell, the same that goes on a 5-inch gun on an American U.S. Navy destroyer. And the flyers called it the Holy Moses. And there you see what those look like coming off the wing. They could very effectively line up with targets and do tremendous damage. The Germans respected this aircraft. They were afraid of it. Now, the two things I got to mention about when you work with air. So, Rose puts it in as a line, use the air. But two things we should keep in mind of using the air in a place like the Ardennes. The first is that you have to have the right radios and the right forward air controllers to talk to these aircraft. This is not something the average soldier can just pick up a radio, tune to the right frequency, and get on this aircraft. The aircraft had different types of radios than the ground units. So you had to have the right radio frequencies and you had to talk their language. Otherwise, this aircraft could hit you just as easily as the Germans. Going by at hundreds of miles an hour at treetop level, one Panzer looks a lot like a Sherman tank, especially when they're covered with snow or white camouflage. So you had to have the right radio frequencies and you had to have quality air controllers integrated with the ground units. That was learned in Normandy, relearned, I should say, from North Africa by the Americans in Normandy. The British had already learned it the hard way in North Africa. Then the second thing you have to do is remember, if you're going to employ air, anything within 600 yards of friendly forces, because of the exploding burst radius of these rockets and gravity bombs and machine gun strafing, anything within 600 yards is danger close. So the friendly units have to mark their position. They put panels on the back of the tanks. The troops might lay out panels on the ground. And the aircraft crew, the pilot, would confirm, I confirm red, along grid line such and such, and then they go in. You could use smoke, but the problem with smoke is it drifts. Yeah. You could also use white phosphorus rounds to mark the enemy, but in the Ardennes, particularly after it snows heavily, the white phosphorus is tough to see except for its initial burst. So, and most smoke rounds were not colored. So this was very difficult work. And sadly, with 3rd Armored Division, there were a few cases of American air hitting 3rd Armored Division, trying to get at the Germans. And part of this is when you're in a desperate fight against Panthers, this is one of the things that evens the odds if you're the Americans. And so they would call it in very close. And anything inside 600 yards is danger close. But remember, 600 yards, that's well within the cannon range of a Panther and even within range of their machine guns aboard. So it's pretty close and pretty dangerous. Not as easy as it sometimes seems in movies. Artillery. It was easier to integrate with artillery because the Army owned that. The Army Air Forces and the American forces were already becoming a separate service. But everybody had artillery. So Rose himself had these self-propelled howitzers with a range of about 7 miles. These were the ones the British call the priest, because it's got a little pulpit up here. And then there were longer weapons. The Americans usually reinforced their divisions, and 3rd Armored Division was no different, with heavier weapons as well, the 155s, which had a range of over 12 miles. And the Americans and British had the ability. The Germans had this too, but they had less artillery and tougher time getting ammunition forward because of the Allied air superiority. One of the reasons they attacked in the Bulge when they did was because the weather was terrible for the first few days, but it did clear right before Christmas and the air went to work. So the Allied artillery, the American artillery in particular, if you could get on their net, and there was an artillery observer with every small unit, every company, battery, troop had artillery observers with them. And here was one, anybody could call on the artillery net in an emergency if they needed to, because they just used the regular ground radios. And if you could call back to them, they could do the calculations and actually mass fire on a single grid square. They could bring it all in together. The American term for this was time on target, or the big shoot. This was done several times, one time just outside Manhay, and it was very, very effective. After the war, when surviving German officers and non-commissioned officers were interviewed and they were asked, what did you fear most about the Americans? They would always mention the air, but in particular about the Americans, they would mention the artillery. So Rose knew this was a big advantage. Now, we should remember one other thing, and that is artillery by itself does not necessarily kill tanks unless it gets a direct hit. Tanks will shrug. Most of what artillery effects are, there's a blast wave, and that can cause concussion. It can kill individuals that are out in the open, but it's a lot of hot metal fragments, shrapnel flying around that cut people up and kill them. That bounces off most tanks. It can damage things. It can get in the radiator, grill, and all that. So when firing this, what it really was designed to do was to separate the German infantry from the tanks, to knock the antennas off the German vehicles so they couldn't talk on their radios, and to get an occasional kill. And when the Germans stopped, if they had to slow down to refuel, and you could catch them, and they did. If they had to stop to fix the tank, and they did. It's worth noting that the German tanks, as we saw, needed more maintenance than the Allied tanks, the Shermans. And so it was not unusual to find Germans out with wrenches and hammers trying to fix their treads. That's when the artillery could get them, because they get the crew out of the tank, kill the crew, and do the job right there. So artillery could be focused. This was of the three things that Rose mentioned, this was the favorite American hammer. And I would tell you, Paul mentioned that I'd served in the U.S. military for quite a while before I got out in 2013 to include combat operations. This hasn't changed. The Americans prefer to use this supporting fire when they can. And it's still very effective. But World War II was where that was learned. Again, the British had already learned a version of this in the Great War, in World War I, and then perfected it in North Africa. Maneuver. This is one we don't think about. So there you see on the slide, it shows Sherman's moving up the road there, and it says maneuvering for a flank or rear shot, which is easy for me to type in. But the reality is very, very tough when working in terrain to get around, use concealment, use the cover of folds in the ground, and work around the back of Panthers so you can shoot them from the side or rear. If you could shoot from the side or rear, you didn't have to close in as close. You might be able to get a hit from as far out as 1,000 meters. 1,000 yards or so. So very, very useful, but also very tricky. Now, why could the Americans do this? The Germans, as great as their tanks were, had lost a lot of people between fighting in the Soviet Union on that front, fighting in the Mediterranean, fighting in Northwest Europe. And replacements were coming in, but they were very young. They were very old. They didn't have a lot of training. The Germans lacked fuel to train their panzer crews. So while you had a thin cadre of old Panzer aces who'd been with it for a long time, a lot of the people were rookies and they hadn't had the training. The Americans and the British, different story. The 3rd Armored Division was a very well-trained division. So one of the guys I depicted here, Sergeant Oriol Piero, he had been with his platoon since Normandy. In his platoon of tanks, there were 20 soldiers, 20 tankers who started the war when they came ashore in Normandy after the D-Day invasion in June. By the end of the war, he was the only one still left, but he was still there and he trained all the replacements. Piero, another one you've probably heard of, if you saw the movie Fury, it's the guy that Brad Pitt plays, although they changed his name to Don Collier. But Lafayette Poole, Staff Sergeant, nicknamed War Daddy, he was another one of these tank commanders. Bob Early, another one of these tank commanders. And these are people who've been covered in various books and movies, and well, they should be. They were the ones who taught these maneuver techniques. Rose said, the Germans have better guns on their tanks. The Germans have thicker armor on their tanks, but I have better gunnery because of my great sergeants and because the training they've given the privates and corporals who work for them. So guys like Piero knew how to maneuver for the flank and rear. And here's a little statistic to keep in mind. and this was very interesting, the U.S. Army did a study after the war of what killed German tanks. They went through every incident they could find. They interviewed surviving Germans. They interviewed their own guys. They actually went over the battlefields and looked at vehicles at sites of major battles. And here's what they found. If you shot first, if you saw the enemy first, shot first, you would kill first 4 times out of 5. So if you got the first shot off, you would win. And here's the other one. And this is just common sense. You don't have to be Karl von Clausewitz or anything, or Erwin Rommel to figure this out. The stationary force in a tank force fight in this era had a huge advantage. 84% of the time after this post-war study, 84% of the time, the stationary tank would be able to see first and fire first and therefore kill first. So one of the techniques the Americans did was when they would maneuver to the flank and rear, they'd go to a short haul. They'd get behind a hummock of ground, they'd get in the trees, and they'd wait. And they'd wait for the movement. And when they saw the Panther moving, then they'd engage. And they'd get that first shot ambush. That in the technology of the time. Now, things have changed. A modern American M1 Abrams tank can fire very well on the move. But this was the way they did it. And remember, in the Bulge, who's attacking? Primarily the Germans. So they are moving. And as a result, this training became invaluable. And it worked. Now, there's one other thing you can do, and that is get better tanks. The Americans did equip, as the British did. They equipped some of their Shermans with 76 millimeter cannon. These were better and could penetrate more of the German armor, but they weren't very many. The Americans only had a small percentage of their force equipped with these longer cannons. Same for the British. The real solution didn't arrive till March of 45, and that was frankly a replacement tank. The T-26E3 Pershing, a T number in an American World War II tank normally means it's an experimental model. And so these were brought in. There were only 20 brought into the European theater. 10 of them went to 9th Armored Division to replace losses from the Battle of the Bulge. The other 10 went to 3rd Armored Division. When you look at this, this was touted as the American Tiger, but it's really more equivalent to the American Panther. And that's more than good enough, although these tanks were effective against Tigers and could penetrate them. Frankly, the thing to remember, although the Tiger tank was very fearsome, the vast majority of them fought on the Eastern Front, not in Northwest Europe. Fortunate for the Americans and British. Every time they tangled with them, they wished they hadn't. But this was a solution. We only had 10 of those, unfortunately, in the 3rd Armored Division, and then 10 in the 9th Armored Division. They would be used again in the Korean War, and they would have an occasional dust-up with the North Korean T-34 tanks there, the Russian models. Close combat was the last thing. Now, this is always depicted in movies, Call of Duty, Fortnite, all these video games and movies always show close combat. This was the last thing you wanted to do with German panzers. Yes, you want to fight their infantry. You're happy to tear up their supply lines. You're willing to hold terrain. But to go out there with an M9 bazooka, a rocket launcher, this is high risk operation. It's a shaped charge warhead. Rocket shoots out. You'll notice in this picture, there's nobody behind this guy because a huge jet of rocket flame is going to come out of there, and anybody back there will be badly injured and burned. And when that fires, it's got a huge signature.
Yeah.
The challenge with the bazooka, good idea, useful against the early German tanks, useful against self-propelled guns and half tracks, but would bounce off a Panther or a Tiger. And the problem is you're within 100 yards. You're within close range. That vehicle's going to tear you up. So
it either works that first time or you're dead, pretty much.
Paul, I describe this to use the American term, and this is a term I took from World War II veterans whose accounts I read. It's a Medal of Honor weapon. If you're successful, you get the Medal of Honor. If you don't, your family gets the telegram, sadly. And the other thing I have here, this is the helmet of Maurice Rose. It's currently in the Museum of the United States Army, just outside Washington, D.C., in Northern Virginia at Fort Belvoir. Rose was actually involved in several close combat situations, and one of them finally ended up with his death on March 30th. He'd encountered a column of German Tiger IIs, King Tigers, Royal Tigers. They pinned his vehicle against a tree, and when he got out and attempted to surrender, the German track commander, it was dark, he couldn't really see what he was doing with. He opened fire with a submachine gun. Interestingly enough, those bullet holes, that although Rose was killed, it was by shots in the body, not in the head. Those bullet holes were from the German submachine gun as the helmet tumbled in the air after the shock of the hits threw it off Rose's head. And he was the highest ranking American killed in action. Leslie McNair, a lieutenant general of the U.S. Army, had been killed in Normandy, but it was by a friendly fire. He was just dead, sadly, during a botched prior attempt at what would become the Operation Cobra bombardment the day before the actual one. But Rose was killed in action against the Germans, and it was against an SS Panzer, a heavy Panzer battalion, the 507, just south of Paderborn. And Paderborn in Germany, by the way, for those of you who remember the Cold War, the British Army of the Rhine used to be up there during the Cold War. So they've some of the studies of that particular engagement that were done by the British are excellent and worth your time, and they are available on the old internet. So just to close my part and then open for discussion, because I know there's been a lot of comments and I know folks probably got questions. The payoff of killing panzers correctly to be able to defeat a Panther required combined arms. A great example of all these things coming together is this still from a very famous video from the fight in front of the Cologne Cathedral on March 6th, 1945. This video is available all over the internet. It was taken.
Yeah, we've shown it on the channel. We had Adam Makos on talking about Spearhead.
Yeah, Adam Makos in the Spearhead.
A year or so ago.
He actually interviewed the Germans and the Americans at this fight. Yeah. And among those who took the picture, Jim Bates, who was a Tech 4 and American military public affairs, took the film, which is just incredible. There are very, very few videos or films of any modern war, since we've had film, where you can actually see an engagement like this play out involving ground forces. And this one does. And it's a reminder, because to get that Panther, the Americans ended up committing a Pershing. There had actually been Shermans that tried to get it, and the Panther had knocked the Shermans out. And they tried infantry with bazookas. They tried all that stuff. And it finally required one of those big T-26 Pershings. Bob Early, one of the great tank commanders of the 3rd Armored Division, his crew closed on him. And I'm glad you mentioned Adam Makos, because his book Spearhead tells this whole story. And for American listeners, you might remember the name Andy Rooney from our old CBS News Network. Andy Rooney was a staff sergeant who covered this battle for Stars and Stripes. So he was standing next to Bates, but he wasn't the cameraman. He witnessed the whole thing. He interviewed everybody, and it stuck with him. And this is in his memoirs, this particular story. But it's a payoff. It shows you when you can bring everything together, even a great German tank like this can be defeated, but it takes combined arms. So enough for me, and I think time to go over to questions and comments.
Well, firstly, what a fantastic presentation that was. I mean, just a masterclass. That's so superb. I'll do some of my questions first, then I'll let the viewers come in with theirs. But, you know, we talked about Maurice Rose, what he achieved. Where does his ability to learn on the job and bring in these initiatives come from? Because when we talk about armored officers, if I had to kind of identify one thing that makes a good armored officer, it's actually being a good all-rounder. Certainly you've got to know communications. You know, when we talk about Guderian, people like that, they understand communications first, maybe armor second. Combined armor, you've got to understand how infantry works. You've got to understand the use of air power. And is it about being a good all-rounder? But where did Rose where did he hone his skills?
Well, you know, we're all products of our experience and education. In Rose's case, he never went to college. In fact, it's not even clear that he finished high school. He was commissioned in World War I in the U.S. Army Infantry based on his score on a test, and went to officer candidate school. So he served in the infantry for about his first 12 years in the Army up to around 1930. And then by his request, he switched to the cavalry. And so he served in the cavalry in the 1930s. And those two branches, as we know, quite different views of how fighting should go. Rose benefited from that. One other thing, he just happened, he was not a West Point graduate. So in the American Army at that time, that would put you ahead of your contemporaries. He didn't have that. So he didn't have an old boys network or anything like that. He had a good reputation, but mainly for his World War I service. And he'd been wounded in World War I and served at the front. But he, in the infantry, when he was in the cavalry, he was picked to go to the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. Now, that's a war college level assignment. He also went to the Command and Staff College, but that was normal for people of his grade in the 30s. But the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, and by the way, Eisenhower went there as well, was the college to learn about logistics. And one of the challenges that the cavalry had, I know it had it in the American Army, I've heard that it had it in the British Army at the beginning of the war, was cavalrymen knew a lot about mounted maneuver. They were all about that. But the logistics of keeping the tank running, the parts, the maintenance time, the fuel, confused them because the horse didn't require all that. You pat the horse on the nose, you give it some hay and water, and it was happy to go. The tank was much more temperamental, particularly early tanks. Rose had covered that stuff in the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. He was actually sent there because that's where they sent the B team guys. You know, the people. Rose is not going to be a general. So, you know, as General Clark said, he wasn't on Clark's list at the beginning of the war. But the reality was that gave him that combined arms background. And then the other thing I think that we have to give credit to Rose for his learning, he believed in the old adage that they tell military commanders, see and be seen. He's not the only guy like that. We've certainly talked about Rommel and Patton, Collins, Ridgway, Montgomery, all these commanders who got up and looked around and smelled the gunpowder and all that. Rose was like that. He'd learned that in World War I. That's the way he led. It's risky. I mean, he got wounded in both World Wars, and he was eventually killed near the end of World War II. But it also means you've got your finger on what's going on. You just can't learn this stuff sticking pins in a map 20 miles behind the lines. And I'm convinced that, combined with his education and his double experience from infantry and cavalry and a little bit of logistics, is why he was such a quick learner. And I think he was a quick learner in general. I mean, here's a guy didn't even finish high school, from what we can tell of his personal records, and yet he was an officer and rose to general officer ranks. You don't do that, particularly in wartime, if you don't have something on the ball. One other thing I should mention, General George S. Patton, for his many faults, was an excellent judge of subordinate leaders. And he picked Rose. Rose was a battalion commander in the 1st Armored Division. Patton commanded 2nd Armored Division. So they only saw him on maneuvers. But when it came time to get a chief of staff for his division, he says, give me that Rose guy. Even though he's a lieutenant colonel, it's a Colonel Billet. He says, I want Rose. He had identified him right away as a quick learner and somebody who could get jobs done.
Well, that's a great answer. And it leads into a question from David Levine about the data of casualty rates within Third Armored. Have you compared 3rd to 2nd to 10th to 7th? And
I have.
Is Rose the kind of guy to kind of pull the Band-Aid off quickly, or is he more of a, ease it off? Because if you're decisive, if you're on the front foot, it may mean you get the results, but it may also mean you suffer the casualties. So where are they on the league table?
David asks a great question, and he may already know the answers, but I'll mention it for everybody. In Steven Zaloga's excellent book, where it's an Osprey book, but in it there's a great table that shows the tank and personnel losses for all the American Armored Divisions. Sadly, the 3rd Armored Division is the leader in both categories.
Right.
Both tanks lost and in casualties suffered. Part of it was Rose was committed to every major battle. Basically the 3rd Armored Division was always in there slugging. Part of it was 1st Army under Hodges' command. Hodges committed 1st Army to some real attrition battles in places like the city of Aachen and the Hürtgen Forest, and 3rd Armored Division, being the tank unit, had to get involved in those, and there was no way around it. They fought in and around the West Wall from September all the way 1944 all the way into February the next year, with that slight diversion, an important one, to go down to the Bulge, but they went right back to it and then had to finish breaking through the West Wall. So 3rd Armored Division was in a lot of tough campaigns, and of course they started in Normandy and the hedgerows. I believe that it reflects the battle record they had. I think with a less capable commander than Rose and the people who worked for him, they would have suffered even heavier losses. But part of it was he was given the most difficult missions. And
yeah, it's the old victim of your own success, isn't it? If you earn a reputation for getting the job done, unfortunately, you get more of the same type of job. That's how it works in every industry, but certainly within the army, it's you never be too good at anything because you end up having it bite you on the arse. But
I want to mention one other thing, though, that just so David knows, and it's important that everybody know this. Rose was not a guy to gild the lily. There were some commanders who would say, yes, I've lost a lot of tanks and men, but let me tell you what I did to the Germans. Rose would never send information forward unless they could verify it, to use a very pejorative term from the Vietnam War, body count. So they would make an actual tank count, and that's all they'd send forward. So Rose's division, although they acknowledged 125 Shermans lost in the Battle of the Bulge, and they counted the German panzers they destroyed, only 118, of which only 31 were Panthers. And he sent that message forward. He could have easily exaggerated. He could have counted burned hulls that somebody else got, maybe the air or whatever. He was an honest man, and he believed that you had to lay it out the way it was. And I think that's to his credit. He didn't shy away from the facts. His troops knew, so there was no point in making it up or spinning it to a thing to make it more happy talk. And I think that's one of the reasons Eisenhower wanted to know from him, how do you beat these guys? Because he knew that Rose could do it, but he also knew that it was at a cost.
And yeah, being honest is important. And that leads again to another question with Renier Gronevel, who did our show about 4th Armored Division's medics a few weeks ago. He's saying about General Rose's published wartime diaries. He's like, I read it recently and sometimes got the impression it was edited using the benefit of hindsight. What's your reaction to that?
What I would warn Renier, the Rose diary, if you will, and I forget the author's name, although I did credit him in my acknowledgments. It's a fiction book. Rose left no actual diary. In fact, there's only one extant letter from Maurice Rose that he wrote to his son, who was only 4 years old. The wife kept it. She got rid of all his correspondence. She was, as you would imagine, pretty distraught after his death. And he left no diary. He was not a diarist. He was a very private man. So the Rose diary book that you can buy on Amazon and all that kind of stuff that purports to be his diary, the author tells you it's fictionalized. What he did is he used an excellent archive that is very reliable and is not made up, that was kept and donated by the Division G2, the intelligence officer, Andrew Barr. And that's at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, the Barr collection. A lot of it has been scanned and is available online. Many of the pictures you saw today come from that Barr collection. And I would urge anybody interested in Maurice Rose and 3rd Armored Division to look at that website. A lot of it's hard copy and it's in old musty files. It's very interesting, but it would take a trip to see it. But what's available will show you there. And that's when the book was written, the author who did it, that's how he put it together. He used those after action reports from units, radio transcriptions and things like that, and put together the story. So you're right. It was edited, and it really is not Rose's diary. There is no actual Rose diary.
Okay. Thank you. And we've got just a quick one, and I'll ask one of mine. This is from Ian Carr. Does Montgomery comment on Rose, and particularly, I guess, Rose's performance in the Ardennes? Because Montgomery's not the greatest person that's spreading out the praise. But does he comment on Rose?
The only comment I could find, and I did cite it in my book, was that Montgomery noted that Rose did his job. And remember, from a guy like Bernard Laud Montgomery, if he says you did your job, that's pretty high praise. That's almost a marriage.
He
mentions him along with Ridgway, Collins. It's noteworthy that Montgomery, for the counterattack phase coming from the north, he wanted Collins 7 Corps under Collins. He wanted Rose, and he also wanted 2nd Armored Division, the other heavy division under Harmon. So he said, "Give me these American divisions for this task." He thought Rose did his job. But Montgomery, I mean, if you're familiar with his work and comments, he's stingy on praise. Yeah. And to me, that's why any comment of an American commander several layers down is indicative that he thought the Rose was
must have done pretty well. So this is kind of my question, and we'll take a couple from the audience again. Going back to the maneuver, because a couple of things sort of registered when you're talking about that. When we're talking about some of the German units, you're absolutely right, of course. Lots of replacement crews coming in, and maybe this is a kind of the theory with the surviving German crews by this point, the experienced guys were maybe the surviving ones because they had perhaps were a little bit more cautious. That the kind of the do or die ones had all been killed in earlier campaigns. So if you're a German tank commander and you're alive in 44, it's because you aren't the one to kind of volunteer to go first round the corner and first. So maybe there's a little bit of a lack of kind of initiative. But you talked about this this example of getting in round the back, trying to get hit from behind. How did it work within the 3rd Armored Division? I think you said this, but I'd like you to elaborate. If you are a sergeant in command of a tank, or you're a loader, you're an artillery officer, and you've got an idea Was there a means of getting your ideas up the chain of command? Because we know certain units, ideas go downwards. It's important they go up as well. How does it work within the 3rd Armored? How does Rose kind of set up the system there?
Well, there was two methods. Let's talk about the most important one, which was the informal method. I mentioned that Maurice Rose was a man who was always out on the ground with his troops. He was not a big talker. That's why no diary or anything like that. He doesn't have much of a public persona. There's not, you can't get on the internet and see his speeches to rile up the troops and get them ready to fight. He was a good listener, and he and his aide took excellent notes. So when he'd go forward, he would participate in the operations, and he would be there with his guys, and he would listen to what they had to say, and then go back and follow up with his staff. Hey, I hear that the anti-personnel rounds are not very good. We need to see if we can get something better for our tank crews. I understand that we need more tracer ammunition for the machine gunners, that kind of thing. So this informal chain, because he did it, his subordinates also did it. So General Hickey, General Boudreaux, the battalion and regimental commanders, they also got out and got that kind of feedback as well. So he set the example in that way, and they followed his example. So the informal is the majority of it. Formal also, one of the great things, and you can see this in the bar archives at the University of Illinois that I mentioned. He insisted, despite combat, that units send in after action reports, more than just a quick carbon copy of their war diary. He wanted, what did they learn? What did they see? A summary, just a line or two. He didn't need a dissertation, but just something I picked up. And he would glean that, and his staff would glean that. His G2 section in particular scrubbed that to try and get information about the Germans and how they were fighting, and then they would disseminate it down. So it was both a formal and an informal system. And I think the informal system really was the more important of the two.
Yeah, no, good answer. And, I want to take it back. We'll do some questions from viewers again to Normandy, because I live in Normandy and I can't help but be focused on Normandy. Because when we look at the armored divisions, British, Canadian, American in Normandy, it's a steep learning curve. There are some trials and tribulations along the way. And of course, there are changes in personnel. Some of the armored divisions that faced the enemy in December 44, it's a different commander that was there in Normandy, and maybe a different one since North Africa if they'd done North Africa and Sicily. So, when Don Fox was on talking about the 4th Armored Division, he was particularly saying that they learned things in Normandy. They particularly learned things in that kind of push towards Brittany that ended up kind of not continuing because the Falaise Gap happened. But in your study, and again coming at this from your professional career, the Ardennes in a sense is the cup final, to use a football analogy there, for the 3rd, and then Cologne being kind of the culmination of it. But you've got to have learnt the fundamentals on the way there. So if you could kind of give 2 or 3 examples of key lessons learned in Normandy, and maybe particularly Rose himself, or maybe at a sort of battalion or company level, what would they be? What were the key lessons?
Yeah. First lesson from Normandy that was absolutely crucial for the 3rd Armored Division was combined arms warfare. Right. And I mentioned that Rose went back to that when they started to face Panthers in numbers later in the war. But they first faced them in Normandy. And this is dealing with the hedgerow terrain, and how do you integrate your artillery, your air, your infantry, your combat engineers, your tanks, your tank destroyers, bring each piece together and get them to work together to break into a hedgerow and destroy the Germans defending it. Rose had the good fortune. He had fought in North Africa with 1st Armored Division and 2nd Armored Division. He'd fought in Sicily with 2nd Armored Division. And now he starts in Normandy as a combat commander, a 1-star general, brigadier general, with the 2nd Armored Division, which, again, was a veteran division, unlike the 3rd Armored Division, whose first combat was in Normandy, in the hedgerows. So Rose brought a lot of knowledge of this to the fight. The other person who was key to teaching this was the guy I mentioned briefly, who was a good commander, who had first learned his craft in the Pacific War out in Guadalcanal with 25th Infantry Division. That's Joe Collins, General Joe Collins.
I'm a big Lawton Collins fan.
Yeah. Well, he was also an individual that believed you had to teach people how to do this, because the training in the United States, while it was fine, could never replicate the danger and friction of fighting actual dug-in Germans. And the Germans were gonna hold those hedgerows as long as they could. They were under orders to do it. They knew that once the Americans broke into open country with their air superiority, with their mobility, and the British and Canadians, it was going to be all over. I mean, it was hold at the hedgerows or hold at the German West Wall on the border. And so, so fighting real Germans takes time. And the other thing I think is the third element of this. Rose doesn't take over the 3rd Armored Division until early August, although he'd been fighting with 2nd Armored Division as a combat command commander the whole rest of the summer. But it's worth mentioning that it takes multiple weeks to learn these techniques. None of them are done quickly. In other words, the first time units try to get into the hedgerows, it's a bloody nose. They're still using the methods that were done in training at Fort Benning, Georgia, or whatever. That was great there, but now you're doing it in real life. Learning things like I must bring the artillery in inside of 600 yards. I got to risk friendly casualties to put the artillery danger close directly in front of me in a barrage as I go forward. Anybody who fought in the Great War knew that by 1918. But that had to be relearned by Americans who were too young to have fought in the Great War. The idea that you could bring the air in very, very closely as long as you had good communications with them. The forward air controllers, Collins insisted, and they were actually put in the forward tanks so that they could be under German artillery fire, under German machine gun fire, and still communicate with the aircraft and bring in the aircraft very close to use those rockets, bombs, and machine guns for the Americans and the cannon for the Typhoons, because Royal Air Force Typhoons also worked with Americans in that battle too. So, but I think time was huge to have the time. I mean, look, Eisenhower, the national capitals with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, America, and Winston Churchill, they were definitely chomping at the bit to get out of the hedgerows. But the reality is that hard learning curve had to be climbed. There was no way around it. There was nothing that was going to replace that actual experience of fighting the Germans.
And also, while the Allies are learning, the Germans are beating themselves into the ground there. They are losing so much of their armored strength that they couldn't use again. When people are critical, we're going off on a tangent, but that's fine. When people are critical of the Allies being slow getting out of Normandy, let's not forget that by the time they get out of Normandy, which was ahead of schedule anyway, they've broken the best part of, how many German divisions it is that haven't got, half a dozen tanks to put together. Okay, 9th and 10th SS get out and 116th get out, but we've broken that many more in Normandy. While the Allies are learning, the Germans are breaking themselves apart. But I'll get to a couple of questions from viewers again. I want to just ask one more for myself, because I'm taking back to something you said about General Rose's honesty when he sends the reports back about we knocked out this. But to me, that's very important, because we know in looking at armor divisions that some commanders, and I don't necessarily mean divisional commanders, I even mean company troop commanders. There's sometimes they're guilty of dismissing the enemy as being, oh well, we'll beat them, we're better than them, and other times building them up to be too much. That they're, oh, we don't want to get anywhere near the Panthers and Tigers, they're too dangerous. The reality is, you look at the reports, for example, of the Sherwood Rangers in Normandy, they were knocking out Panthers and Tigers with regular Shermans within a few days of the beaches. But you've got to be honest with your men and say, in some cases their armor is better than ours, their guns are with that, but they are capable. We can knock them out. Here's how you do it. But don't piss down my back and tell me it's raining. That don't tell us that they're ineffective, and don't tell us they're too good. Do you think Rose was good at just pitching it honestly?
I do, and I think it helped that he was a veteran of the Great War, and that he was a veteran of North Africa and Sicily. So he knew the Germans. He knew how they fought. He understood them. He had some ability in the language, so he could talk to German prisoners. He could read German documents. Those understanding your enemy is important. And I think the right word for your enemy, and the Germans were loathsome. I mean, the ideology was horrendous. And, in case of Maurice Rose, we haven't mentioned this, but, he's a Jewish American.
Yeah.
So, had he lived in that part of Europe, he and his family would have been sent to the gas chambers if they could be caught. And so, but what he did have, even though he loathed the Nazi Germans as an entity, he respected them as an enemy. And I think this is something, at least even in my own experience fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, we have a tendency to discount our enemies. And that may be sometimes useful for morale purposes, but it's very dangerous when you're in a war. The enemy always has capabilities, and they may not look anything like you or fight anything like you. The Germans did come from the same Western European military tradition as the British, Canadians, Americans, free French. But you've got to give them their due. You cannot dismiss them and just say, oh, well, these guys don't know how to fight, because they're killing you and they're carrying out their tasks. So it's not happening by accident.
Yeah, no, definitely. This is more of a technical question. This is from Rainier again there. And it's you're talking about the heavy armor divisions and the light armor divisions. What's your opinion on the performance of heavy versus light, and on the role of reserve command, kept as reserve or deployed as third combat command? So this is someone who knows his armored organization here, but if you'd like to address that one, that'd be fantastic.
I will. I'll start with Rainier's second question and tell him the combat command reserve was in all divisions was used as a third armored command. I mean, they did. They realized they needed it. 3 is about the right number. And the current structure of American combat division, and it's been this way since the Vietnam era, is consciously patterned on those combat commands. Our current brigades, we always have 3. We've sometimes had 4, but we've always had at least 3. And part of it is to give this flexibility to carry out operations. And then the first question, heavy versus light, I will tell you the 2 heavy armor divisions were always respected for their punch because they could take more losses, particularly in tanks. But they were infantry poor. If you got 3 extra tank battalions, you need 3 extra infantry battalions. So it's in the Battle of the Bulge, there was a regiment from the 75th Infantry Division that was attached to Rose's division to get him enough infantry. Later, when he goes into Cologne, he'll have a regiment from the 104th Infantry Division, General Terry Allen's division, the Timberwolves, had a regiment attached for the Cologne operation. So both 2nd and 3rd Armored Division usually needed an attached regiment of infantry, which meant one of the infantry divisions was going to fight a regiment short. Because in American parlance, the regiment is 3 battalions in World War II, sort of like a British brigade in World War II. So the light armor divisions were great. They were much more flexible. The other thing I should mention, Rose handled it okay. I can tell you his partners in 2nd Armored Division handled it okay, but their predecessors, the ones who got fired in Normandy, did not handle it okay. There was a confusion about what to do with the armored and infantry regimental headquarters that seemed sort of superfluous. They wanted to swap the battalions around. So what do I do with this colonel in his headquarters? I've already got a brigadier general in a headquarters. Do I make him a deputy? Rose, his method was to sort of have a heavy punch and a light punch under each combat command. One would be his best battalion commander, the light punch, and the regimental commander would have the 2 regiment or the 2 battalion commanders who were considered not as strong tactically. And again, when you look at 3rd Armored Division, they went through a lot of leadership changes at lower level. When you're talking battalion commanders and also some regimental commanders, some of those are because of fatal casualties or serious wounds. It's not because of people getting fired. Some of them getting killed.
Yeah, no, great response. And we'll go back to a couple of viewer questions, but another one, it strikes me in the parts of your book I read, and I confessed to Dan earlier, I didn't read it all because I get so many books to read, but I read the good bits, is that when we look at things like the Ardennes or Normandy, there are lots of historians who come at it from the angle that is their specialty. They come at it from the point of view of air power or artillery or armored warfare or infantry or reconnaissance, whatever it would be, cavalry groups. To me, the Ardennes particularly seems to be one of the battles. You've got to approach it, to use a pun, on the broad front of understanding, as I say, this combined arms, all the elements linking together. Because, something we talked about with Steve Zaloga is when you're talking about the Typhoons and the P-47s, it's the soft skins the Germans had. It's hitting the fuel, hitting the transport behind, hitting the trains that are coming out of Germany. It's that to look at the Ardennes and say, well, this was the thing that did it. And we talked about the cliche of everybody focusing on the 101st in Bastogne, which was great, but it's one of many, many things that all slotted into place then. Is that something you feel, having commanded it? I mean, I wouldn't even attempt to list the different types of command you had because you pretty much did everything. It's important to understand all of those, better address something as complicated as the Ardennes. Is that true?
Yeah, I think it is. And in fact, just to give a perfect example, I am a whole 101st Airborne guy, although I did not fight in combat with them, but it is the unit I served longest with in the U.S. Army. So I had the opportunity at one time to meet Lieutenant General Harry W. Kennard, who was the G3, the operations officer of the division at Bastogne. General Kennard made the exact same point that you just did. He said, everybody talks about the 101st of Bastogne. He says, you realize we had 4 artillery battalions. We had parts of 2 armored divisions with us. Yeah. We had elements of the 28th Infantry Division. He said, we were not an airborne division. He says, we were fighting as a combined arms division almost a core when you look at all the combat power that we had. And his point, and to include the supporting air power and all that, and his point was, remember, it always takes a team. As much as we love our own regiment or our own division or whatever like that, to fight an enemy as dangerous as the Germans in World War II, you've got to fight as a team. And that's an allied team. It's an all-arms team. It's an air-ground team. For the landings, you have to involve the Navy and all that. I mean, you can't do it with a single arm. And attempts to do it with a single arm invariably met with disaster.
And in a weird way, the Baston defense was almost like an enlarged German Kampfgruppe. It was that idea of a bit of artillery, a bit of armor, a bit of infantry, a bit of this, all thrust together to do that job. It's almost taken a leaf out of the Germans' book. But I'm going to bring up a question that I just saw there from Woody Lee there. Did the addition of gyro stabilizers on the US tanks help to offset the advantage that the static has in an engagement? It's a good technical question.
Yes, it did. As Woody probably knows, the gyro stabilizers were first introduced during the Second World War. Frankly, the older tank commanders, guys like Aurelio Pereiro and Lafayette Poole, they didn't trust them. They said, no, we've been trained to fire at the halt or short halt. So they didn't fully trust them. So we have anecdotal information on how well they worked. But they were never the experienced tank commanders. And Paul reminded us, but it's important to remember, when you look at a tank platoon, American tank platoons at that time had 5 tanks. Only one of them has an officer, and he's a very young second lieutenant normally, who's brand new and won't stay there long. Hopefully, get promoted out of it and not get a casualty. But the others are all led by sergeants, and so as a result, these sergeants, they had their experience. And the tough sergeants in 3rd Armored Division, who remember have fought all the way since Normandy. When the gyro stabilizer is introduced, they use it, but they don't trust it. They trust the way they were trained. And I think it's a great point to make for any new device or equipment. Until you train on it, it's just a potential. And I think if they would have had time to pull off the line and train, and they sometimes did, some units did, they probably got better use out of it. But to get issued something in combat, if you haven't worked on it and don't have time to work on it, you tend to say, okay, that's nice, but I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, great answer. And just one more for me, then perhaps we'll wind things up, is we're talking about these developments of armor coming in. And because you've been there and done it, all new kit has teething problems. Doesn't matter how good it is on paper, whether it's a simple bit of clothing or the latest sophisticated weapons system, it's going to have teething problems. On balance, when you look at something, a unit like the 3rd Armored Division, because they are upgrading their Shermans, they are adding, they're getting the Easy 8s and things by the end of the war, and the artillery is upgrading. The M8 Greyhound would have been a pie in the sky dream 4 years earlier. Are the 3rd Armored Division kind of good at phasing these things in at kind of the right speed? Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Bring them in, test them out. How would you rank them on that score?
They seem to be particularly effective at it. I think it went with their general sort of good feedback loop up and down their chain of command. The other thing I got to credit the U.S. Army for is they had a tendency to go with incremental change. The only major change that happened during Rose's tenure of command, that last year of the war, was the introduction of the Pershing tank. There was also a light tank, the Chaffee. They brought a couple of them into the recon battalion to replace the M5 Stuarts, but they didn't get a lot of experience with them. Basically, it was a Stuart with a 75 millimeter cannon, but still light armor and all that. And Rose and his experienced tank commanders had learned, you don't put light tanks against German panzers. You use them to deal with German infantry. You use them on flanks for reconnaissance, check out a bridge or something. You don't want to go tank to tank with that. But yeah, other than the 10 Pershings, everything was an incremental change. So as you said, the latest model of Sherman, a new type of ammunition. For the artillery, when they get the variable time fuse, which has a little proximity, little radar thing in the nose to make it go off above the tree or the enemy position, versus the old time fuse where you cranked in the time. Same idea, but a slightly different approach. Incremental change, and I think that was a real strength of the Allied forces in general. They could make those incremental changes.
Yeah, no, definitely. And when we talk about going on another tangent here, that those initiatives at the end of the March, April 45, the Chaffees coming in, the Pershings, at this point, I don't want to be disrespectful, but we've sort of taken our foot off the gas a bit because we know we're going to win the war. There's no need for us to gamble now, really. I mean, some people would argue and say there's still some tough fighting in April and May, but ultimately, in the big picture, we're through the worst now, and there is a deliberate attempt to kind of ease off on the loss of life for those last few weeks and try and just, as frankly, let the Russians take on some of the pressure as well, which is another subject. But the last few weeks maybe aren't as accurate to judge because we aren't going in it with the same urgency we were a few months earlier. But another little technical question there from Brian here: what is your ideal tank platoon TOE?
Well, you mentioned that everybody's a product of their experience. So ideally, I like the current one used by the United States Army, and that is a section of 2 and a section of 2 to make a platoon. You have the platoon leader section with the lieutenant. You have the platoon sergeant section with the senior non-commissioned officer. And then each of them has a wingman who's a staff sergeant. And 4 is a pretty good number. And with the current type of tanks, we have the M1 series that we've been using since late 1970s, early 80s. Those are pretty mechanically reliable tanks. And so you can usually keep them up and going. One of the challenges they had, 5 tanks in World War II was great. They had to have a heavy section, a light section, as they call it, a 3 and a 2, but it's an odd number. And there's odd numbers are good for some things in the military, but for whatever reason, they're not good at the platoon level. If you look at like an infantry platoon in the U.S. Army, there's 3 rifle squads, but there's also a weapons squad, and you can mix and match there as you need to. And so you can operate with 4 sub-elements. They used to, and I mean, nowadays I've heard people say, well, with computers and with modern technology, this isn't required, but I'll tell you it is. They used to talk about something back in the old days when I was being trained called span of control. And they argued that an individual leader, I mean, I suppose Napoleon could handle a big one, but normal humans, between 2 and 5 subordinates was about all you could handle. And so that's something to keep in mind too. So at least for me, I would say 4 tanks, that seems to work.
Cool. Brilliant. And we'll make this the last one. From Iron Rain, did the 3rd AD upgrade from 75 to 76?
They did. And the numbers were in the slide set there. I don't know if Paul posted, but I showed you what the numbers were at the time of the Bulge. Basically, a percentage of their tanks had been upgraded. There you can see it, about a quarter. And those were useful. I mean, you could get some frontal shots even on a Panther or Tiger, depending on the exact range and angle. You could definitely side and rear further out. So yes, they liked them. And the goal, Rose's plan was to try and get one of these in every platoon. Now, it did violate one of the things I've already mentioned, the interchangeable parts thing that, everything was sort of based on a Sherman. In this case, when you went with that, you had to bring 2 types of main gun ammunition down when it was time to reload and all that kind of stuff. So there are some challenges with it. But the penetration, the ability to get a hit and kill on German Panzers made it worth it for 3rd Armored Division.
Perfect. Well, I think we will kind of wind things up because it's better to leave the audience wanting more. But last thing, what are you working on next? Because it seems to me that, this is only going to be the start. I know you've written on, say Iraq and Afghanistan, but it seems you've got a good grasp of World War II. So what would be are you working on something? What's coming up?
Well, I am, and it wouldn't surprise you. I'm looking right now at the Allied Airborne Forces, and I don't know exactly which direction I'm going to go in. But to the great ideas that involve armies in World War II, particularly fighting in Europe and the Mediterranean theater, are armored force and airborne force.
Yeah,
different approaches to try and solve the same problem. How do you get through an enemy front? Well, in the airborne case, you go over it, and so that's what I'm looking at.
Brilliant. I was talking to Ian Johnson last week, who wrote Faustian Bargain about the Soviet-German relationship, and his new book is on Ridgeway. And I thought, there's someone who deserves a good study. I mean, he's always included, but I think attention has gone to other people, and Ridgeway definitely, because of sheer number of wars he was involved in, it makes it interesting for a start. But it's good that we can go back and look at some of these and reevaluate. And we come back to it again and again on the channel, the historiography. We've now got this body of work. What were we thinking about armored formations in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, 70s, and now? And people like yourself bringing in the modern lessons, looking at it and saying, okay, we can now chart this progress. We can see the development. We can see the changes in in doctrine, but also public perception. You know, certain commanders were revered 30 years ago, celebrated now, and vice versa. So yeah, I think your writing will benefit us, because I can't wait to read what you're talking about next. So brilliant stuff. I'll just remind the folks what we've got coming back up, and I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a second. So tomorrow, folks, same time, 7 p.m. UK time, Prit Buttar, the English historian, is coming on to talk about the Eastern Front, particularly fighting in the Ukraine, from his brilliant books, The Reckoning, and you know who Brit is. He's been on several times before. That'll be fantastic. Jonathan Ware, the Brit, is coming on to talk about British steel in Normandy. So we're going to sort of blow apart some of the myths of Hill 112, Churchill, Sherman Fireflies. Again, John has been crunching the numbers of exactly how you could knock out Panthers, Tigers. That'll be a great show. And then Daniel Leahy on Friday is doing Australians, Stuart tanks in New Guinea. And another show on Friday in the evening, Nicholas Moran, the chieftain on YouTube, is going to talk about American tank destroyer units in North Africa and Tunisia. So hell of a lot of stuff coming your way this week. But right now, don't forget, folks, the link to Daniel's book is in the description below, and there's other books he's written as well. I recommend them all, so check that out. But right now, it just remains me to say thank you very much, Dan, for joining us. Did you enjoy talking to our motley crew today?
I enjoyed it a lot, and now I got some more things to learn and some more books to read.
Brilliant, and it stands to goes without saying, you're invited back whenever you want to come back on. Elaborate on armored techniques, look at doctrine, look at Rose, look at something else. You're welcome anytime. Your knowledge and passion is absolutely incredible. So it's been great talking to you. So there we are then. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying I'll see you all again tomorrow evening. Thank you very much for your attention today, and don't forget, hit that subscribe button. Cheers, everybody. Bye.